For years, the name Tian Hairong has been associated with success, influence, and a carefully constructed trajectory within the Chinese film industry. An actress, director, and businesswoman, her public figure represented the archetype of the woman who had managed to traverse the system without visible stumbles. However, in recent weeks, that portrait began to crack in an unexpected way. Not because of an official statement or a judicial sentence, but due to a silent gesture that went almost unnoticed at first: the discreet withdrawal of her new film from one of the most important cinema chains in the country. The contrast was immediate and disturbing. Just a day earlier, Tian Hairong herself had appeared before the media presenting her most recent film project, a work in which she served not only as director but also as the protagonist. In front of the cameras, her speech was charged with emotion. At a specific moment, upon mentioning the name of the actor Yu Menglong, her tears seemed to flow without restraint. For some, that scene could be interpreted as a genuine expression of grief. For others, it was exactly the opposite, the trigger for a collective indignation that had been accumulating for some time. Why did tears, which in other circumstances would have awakened compassion, provoke such a violent reaction in public opinion? What was behind that name which, when spoken aloud, transformed a film premiere into a symbol of social rejection? Yu Menglong, a young actor whose career was beginning to consolidate, passed away under circumstances that the authorities officially classified as an accident. The version pointed to a fall from a residential building. However, from the very first moment, broad sectors of the public considered that this explanation left too many questions unanswered. The scene did not match his habitual place of residence. The prior context was confusing, and indirect testimonies began to multiply with a speed that was difficult to control. While the case seemed to stagnate in the legal realm, something different began to activate in the digital space. Forums, social networks, and opinion platforms, filled with improvised analysis, alternative reconstructions, and chains of information attempting to connect apparently unconnected dots. In this framework, the name of Tian Hairong emerged with increasing frequency, not as a formal accusation, but as a figure surrounded by questions. The withdrawal of her film was not officially announced. There were no communiques or public explanations. However, for many observers, that silent act was interpreted as a signal. In a context where the law appeared not to advance and official answers did not calm doubts, social pressure began to manifest in other ways. But behind the glamour, the public excuses, and the carefully calculated gestures, a deeper question arises. What mechanisms actually operate when an individual tragedy collides with the interests of power, money, and public image? In this analysis, we will explore every layer of this story, from the initial details that awakened suspicion to the visible consequences that continue to expand today. Because understanding this case is not just talking about a death, but observing how the silent gears of the entertainment industry function when the truth becomes uncomfortable. The night Yu Menglong lost his life quickly became a blind spot within the official narrative. According to the authorities' statement, the actor allegedly died after falling from the window of a high-end apartment. The case was classified as an accident, a conclusion that, in legal terms, seemed to close the file quickly. However, for a significant part of public opinion, that explanation failed to dispel the sensation that something essential had been left out of the frame. The first element that raised doubts was the location of the incident. The apartment from which Yu Menglong fell did not correspond to his habitual residence. That night, according to information disseminated later, the actor was at a private gathering attended by around 17 people, several of them linked to the world of film and entertainment. Under normal circumstances, this fact might not have generated major controversy. However, in a context where death occurs suddenly and without clearly identified direct witnesses, every detail began to acquire specific weight. Within a few hours of the news becoming public, contradictory versions emerged regarding who was present and exactly where they were at the moment of the incident. One of the names mentioned was that of director Cheng Ching-song, a figure with a consolidated career and long-standing personal ties to Tian Hairong. Facing a growing speculation, Cheng Ching-song reacted immediately through his social networks, categorically denying his presence at the scene. He claimed to be in Beijing for work reasons and maintained that, at the exact moment of the events, he was dining with former classmates, accompanied by Tian Hairong herself. The speed and precision of his statement, far from closing the debate, introduced new questions. In particular, the effort to underscore apparently secondary details drew attention, such as his physical appearance, pointing out that he had dyed his hair red for years, which did not match the description of the man captured in some images disseminated unofficially on social networks. For some observers, this insistence was interpreted as a preventive defense rather than a simple clarification. In parallel, Tian Hairong publicly expressed her discomfort at having been linked to the case. She declared that she had never known Yu Menglong in life and that any insinuation regarding her implication was causing her considerable emotional damage. From a formal perspective, her stance aligned with the presumption of innocence and the right not to be the object of unfounded accusations. However, the social climate at that moment was no longer governed solely by official communiques, but by a generalized distrust toward institutional narratives. The central question that began to circulate was not whether there was direct proof of responsibility, but why so many pieces seemed not to fit together. How was it possible that a case classified as an accident generated such a volume of parallel information, leaks, indirect testimonies, and alternative reconstructions? For many internet users, the answer did not lie in an isolated event, but in a known pattern within the industry: the management of reputational risk when a public figure dies in uncomfortable circumstances. From this approach, the supposed motives of the actors involved began to be analyzed on two different levels. On the visible plane, the statements sought to preserve emotional stability, professional image, and the continuity of projects. No one wanted to be dragged into a crisis that could extend beyond the personal realm. On a deeper level, according to the analysis of public opinion, less explicit factors came into play: the protection of economic interests, the containment of the scandal, and the need to avoid a domino effect within the sector. The entertainment industry, characterized by millionaire investments and complex relationships between capital, politics, and culture, does not usually tolerate prolonged uncertainty well. A single poorly managed case can affect production companies, distribution platforms, and commercial agreements in a chain. Under this logic, the silence, the speed in closing the case, and the alignment of versions were interpreted as mechanisms of systemic self-protection rather than simple coincidences. As the days passed, The perception that the story had been frozen at a convenient point was reinforced. No new official explanations emerged, but neither was the debate silenced. This stagnation fed the idea that the truth had not necessarily been hidden directly, but diluted in a web of procedures, communiques, and administrative timing. At this point, the case of Yu Menglong ceased to be solely a personal tragedy to become a mirror of something broader. The discussion no longer revolved only around how a young actor died, but whether the system was designed to respond with transparency when the answers could prove uncomfortable for influential figures. The doubt floating in the air was unsettling. Was it an unfortunate accident, or a series of decisions made so that this version would be the only one possible? This question, far from dissipating, would be the fuel that would drive the next phase of the story, when attention shifted from the event itself toward the collective reaction that was about to be unleashed. The public reaction did not occur gradually. It was an avalanche. The moment Yu Menglong's name stopped appearing solely in official statements and began circulating on social networks, the case acquired a completely different dynamic. The narrative was no longer controlled by institutions or authorized spokespersons, but by millions of users who shared, analyzed, and reinterpreted every fragment of available information. Digital platforms transformed into an informal court. Comments, screenshots, reconstructed timelines, and alleged indirect testimonies propagated with a speed that surpassed any attempt at containment. In this environment, the figure of Tian Hairong went from being a recognized professional to becoming the axis of extreme polarization. There was no middle ground. For some, she was a victim of unjustified accusations. For others, she represented the symbol of a power that rarely renders accounts. One of the moments that intensified this perception was her public appearance during the presentation of her new film. The event, originally conceived as an artistic celebration, turned into a stage of tension. When Tian Hairong mentioned Yu Menglong and broke down in tears, the reaction was immediate, but not in the expected direction. Instead of generating empathy, the gesture was interpreted by a part of the public as a calculated representation. The authenticity of the emotion was questioned, not because there was concrete proof of falsity, but because the context was already charged with mistrust. Comment section filled with messages oscillating between indignation and sarcasm. Many users stated that, in an environment where a young actor had lost his life abruptly, it was not the time to exhibit sensitivity in front of the cameras. Others pointed out the asymmetry in media exposure. While certain content related to Yu Menglong disappeared quickly from some platforms, the promotional material for the film continued to circulate normally for a time. This perception of inequality further fueled collective anger. The turning point arrived when it became known that a major cinema chain had discreetly withdrawn the film from its programming. There were no official announcements or detailed explanations. However, in the digital ecosystem, silence rarely goes unnoticed. For many observers, this decision was read as a form of preventive distancing, a common strategy when a brand or institution seeks to avoid being dragged down by a growing controversy. From that moment on, the discussion ceased to focus solely on the facts of the death and shifted toward the tangible consequences of the scandal. Informal analysts began to point out the potential impact on advertising contracts distribution agreements, and future projects associated with Tian Hairong's name. Ushudi. Although no company confirmed specific cancellations, the logic of the market was clear to the public. In an industry based on perception, controversy has an immediate cost. Polarization intensified. On one hand, there were those who defended the need to respect the legal process and warned about the dangers of judging without conclusive proof. This group insisted that social pressure should not replace formal investigation. On the other hand, there was an increasingly large sector arguing that, precisely because legal mechanisms seemed stalled, the only available tool was public visibility. From this perspective, institutional silence was not neutral, but a way of perpetuating doubt. Amidst this clash of stances, the figure of Yu Menglong began to acquire a symbolic dimension. He was no longer just a deceased actor, but the representation of all those who, according to the popular narrative, had been silenced by structures larger than themselves. His name was repeated in posts calling not to forget, not to let the story be diluted by the passage of time and the appearance of new scandals. For Tian Hairong, the situation transformed into an unprecedented image crisis. Every move, every past post, and every professional relationship was examined under a magnifying glass. Even actions that, in another context, would have gone unnoticed were reinterpreted as signs of excessive power or influence. The logic of the network admitted no voids. Where confirmed information was missing, hypotheses emerged. This phenomenon highlighted an uncomfortable reality for the entertainment industry. In the digital age, crisis management no longer depends solely on official statements or carefully scripted press conferences. The narrative can escape control in a matter of hours and transform into a collective judgment that does not respond to the timing or standards of the legal system. The question that began to resonate most strongly was not whether public opinion was right or not, but what happens when trust between society and institutions erodes to this point. When the public stops believing that official versions are sufficient, the reaction is not silence, but amplifications. And in that process, the consequences become real, measurable, and, in many cases, irreversible. This phase of the story left a clear mark. Regardless of the legal outcome, the case had already crossed a threshold from which return was impossible. Attention was now directed toward the darker aspects, toward rumors of silent agreements and control mechanisms that, if confirmed, would completely change the reading of what occurred. The stage was set for the most critical point of the tale, the one where suspicions reach their maximum intensity and the narrative enters dangerous territory. The darkest point of the case began to take shape when suspicion ceased to be simple emotional interpretations and transformed into concrete tales, repeated again and again from different unofficial sources. It was then that the public debate took a decisive turn. It was no longer solely about an unexplained death, but about the possibility that, behind the institutional silence, existed an architecture of control designed to contain any fissure in the official version. One of the elements that generated the most unease was the appearance of information related to alleged payments intended to guarantee the silence of people living in the vicinity of the incident site. According to accounts disseminated on digital platforms, several residents allegedly received considerable sums of money shortly after the death of Yu Menglong, accompanied by a clear request not to speak to anyone about what they had seen or heard that night. These claims impossible to verify independently at that time, spread rapidly due to the internal coherence of the testimonies and the persistence with which they were shared. Some accounts describe discreet meetings, unexpected phone calls, and visits made with extreme caution. Others went further and mentioned a climate of fear where silence was not bought solely with money, but also with veiled warnings. Graffiti on doors, minor material damage, and intimidating messages were part of a narrative that, if true, suggested a level of organization difficult to attribute to isolated actions. Although these versions lacked judicial backing, their emotional impact was profound because they pointed to a pattern that the public had already seen reflected in other scandals of the past. In this context, one episode in particular intensified the general distrust. Tian Hairong shared an image on social networks related to a police statement regarding the case. What drew attention was not the content of the text, but an apparently technical detail, the presence of a personal watermark on a document that, it was assumed, should be of public or institutional access. Shortly after, the post was deleted. For many observers, this gesture was interpreted as an involuntary demonstration of access to privileged information, a sign of closeness to structures that normally remain out of the reach of common citizens. Far from dispelling doubts, the deletion of the image reinforced the sensation of opacity. In the logic of public opinion, it was not about proving direct interference, but asking why a figure from the entertainment world seemed to move with such ease in a terrain reserved for authorities and official bodies. The narrative began to shift from what happened to who has the capacity to influence how what happened is told. This shift led inevitably to an exhaustive review of Tian Hairong's personal and professional trajectory. Her history, marked by an early transition from actress to businesswoman, was reinterpreted in the light of the scandal. Her marriage to Xu Ming, a tycoon whose fortune and political connections had been widely documented in the past, was recalled. The relationship between economic power and political power, so characteristic of certain recent periods, became a central element of the collective analysis. The fall from grace of Xu Ming, his imprisonment, and his subsequent sudden death in prison added an additional layer of complexity. Officially, his passing was attributed to natural causes. However, the moment it occurred, just when speculation regarding possible patrimonial disputes was rife, fueled unconfirmed theories for years. Following his death, Tian Hairong remained as one of the main beneficiaries of an estate estimated in extraordinary figures. Under normal conditions, this fact would have been a side note. In the climate generated by the Yu Menglong case, it transformed into a symbol of the continuity of power beyond individuals. For a part of the public, the link between these elements was not proof, but context. A context that explained why, in the face of a crisis, certain names seemed protected by an invisible network of silences, influences, and resources. Tian Hairong's personal history ceased to be read as that of a successful woman and came to be analyzed as that of someone who had learned to survive and prosper within a deeply hierarchical system. At this point, the tale reached its climax. Not because a definitive revelation emerged, but because the sum of indications, rumors, and antecedents built an image that proved difficult to ignore. The case of Yu Menglong became a metaphor for something broader: the fragility of truth, when faced with consolidated power structures. The question was no longer whether every detail was exact, but why so many people were willing to believe that the official version was not sufficient. Paradoxically, this accumulation of suspicions produced a form of clarity. For many observers, it became clear that even if direct manipulation was never proven, the system itself allowed doubts to persist unresolved. And that possibility, on its own, was cause for alarm. The story stopped focusing on concrete culprits and began to point to a structural problem: the distance between legal truth and the truth perceived by society. With this background, the case entered an irreversible phase. The questions raised could no longer be undone by the passage of time. The narrative had surpassed the realm of entertainment to install itself in a deeper debate on responsibility, transparency, and collective memory. What followed from that moment on would not depend solely on official investigations, but on the capacity of society not to let the story dissolve into oblivion. With the passage of time, the case of Yu Menglong did not close, it transformed. Although on the legal plane the official conclusion remained unaltered, something different occurred in the social space. The story ceased to depend exclusively on documents and rulings to install itself in the collective memory as an open wound, a question without a clear answer that continues to resonate beyond the initial headlines. The silent withdrawal of a film, the progressive distancing of brands and platforms, and the visible caution of certain sectors of the industry evidenced an uncomfortable reality. Even when the law does not advance, moral and economic pressure can generate tangible consequences. It was not a formal punishment, but an organic reaction, fragmented, driven by the perception that something essential had not been explained with the necessary clarity. For Tian Hairong, the present remained marked by an ambiguity difficult to dispel. Her trajectory, built over decades between art and business, came to coexist with a parallel narrative that could no longer be ignored. Regardless of the veracity of any accusation or suspicion, the case revealed the extent to which public image can become fragile when the bond of trust with society is broken. In the digital age, it is not enough to be legally acquitted. Consistency, transparency, and a capacity for response that goes beyond formal communiques are also demanded. The legacy of Yu Menglong, for his part, transcended his artistic career. His name became an involuntary symbol of a broader concern: the sensation that there are stories that never get told completely when they interfere with greater interests. For many, remembering him does not mean affirming a specific version of the facts, but resisting oblivion. It is an act of memory, not of accusation. From this case emerges a lesson that goes beyond the specific individuals. In a system where money can accelerate silences and influence can mold narratives, public opinion has transformed into a decisive actor. Not always fair, not always precise, but undeniably powerful. Cancel culture, implicit boycott, and constant vigilance do not substitute for justice, but they fill the void it leaves when it fails to convince. The final question is not whether the absolute truth will come to light one day, but what society does in the meantime. Does it accept silence as a sufficient answer, or does it keep uncomfortable questions alive? The case of Yu Menglong suggests that currently, forgetting is no longer automatic. Every unfinished story remains latent, waiting for the moment to reappear. Perhaps the deepest teaching is this: Justice does not always manifest as a sentence, but collective memory has its own way of persisting. In a world where official versions can be closed quickly, social consciousness has become a living archive. And as long as there is someone willing to remember, to ask, and not to look the other way, these stories will continue to demand answers. The future of this case remains open. Not because a definitive revelation is necessarily expected, but because the conversation has not yet ended. And in that conversation, every voice, every doubt, and every act of memory counts.